Yo, Tuesday, Wild Economic News, and we'll start with the Financial Times and Clive Crooks, who is their US correspondent, who writes, "The world had better start paying attention to the US government's inability to govern. The prevailing mood over this has been strangely complacent. 6 months of the fiscal year gone, and only now a ramshackled budget. Government brought to the brink of shutdowns over trifling disagreements? Question mark. Absurd, one thinks. But this is Washington. Do as most Americans do and regard the pantomime with blithe contempt. In the end, out of sheer exhaustion, the actors do their deals and it is business as usual. So it proved with the shutdown farce." Forget all that last bit and go back to the first sentence. The world had better start paying attention to the US government's inability to govern. Moving on, Carl Denninger and his famous chart of US GDP and stuff. He gets his deficit number by taking the big number, the trillion number, 11, 12, 13 trillion, that one, for 1 year and for the next year, and taking one from t'other and saying that was the deficit for the year, which I think is a decent way of doing it. The thing he's doing in this chart is getting the announced GDP and backing out that deficit number on the premise that just borrowing money and putting it into the economy isn't real GDP. It's nominal GDP, the number's there, but it ain't real because you've only borrowed it. And technically you should pay it back. And the numbers come out, and the red line minus 8%, minus 14%, and back up to minus 8%. The US ain't doing much business, really. It's borrowing and spending a lot of money, but if it had to not borrow and spend money, it would be in Disasterville, Florida. Right, move on. Back to Pink Pinks and the Financial Times and Wolfgang Munschau. Europe must see Spain is next. European politicians have every incentive to postpone crisis resolution indefinitely. They're always doing that. They're masters at it. In the meantime, the debt of several peripheral Eurozone countries continues to build. On Wednesday, Portugal finally accepted the inevitable and applied for financial rescue. European officials quickly pronounced it would be the last ever rescue. Everyone in Brussels fell over themselves to argue Spain would be safe, but their arguments are merely a metric of the complacency that has characterized the European crisis from the start. Okay, let's go straight into Gavin Davis below about the emerging markets. This week, the continuing strength of global equities in the face of several shocks to the world economy became more impressive, or puzzling, depending on your point of view. Oil prices rose to a level that could become a serious problem for the upswing. The ECB became the first major central bank to tighten monetary policy. Portugal finally accepted the inevitable. Yet global equities continued to rise. Some investment banks have now tipped the emerging markets as the right place to be if developed economies slow under the weight of rising oil prices, but I am far from convinced about this. This is Gavin Davis, who I'm labelling at the moment a top guy. Now he's saying emerging markets aren't the go-to place for your money, and I tend to agree, because if the established nations start falling back, the fact still is that the emerging markets make their money by selling to the established nations, the established market. And the established fall back, that's us. The emerging will fall back as well. And liquidity, capital flows will come out of the emerging markets back home to the nice rich nations. But I'd like to note here, we've got emerging markets here. Europe, we can include the United Kingdom and Japan in this. And first off, we had the United States and their farcical politics. I think politics has established itself as totally farcical and has been able to be farcical for the last 60 years on the back of oil being extremely cheap, energy being extremely cheap. And this has made it possible for politicians to be idiots. And I think we've come to the end of this, but their idiocy is so ingrained now, there will be no moving from idiot politicians to wise, sensible politicians who can do anything to save us from this inevitable destruction. Oh, didn't mean to say that. There we go. Anyway, The Telegraph. Britain's deficit-cutting plans are oxymoronic, says former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers. So Larry Summers chipping in about the UK. However, Mr. Summers said he was sceptical that a policy focused on improving fiscal hygiene, that's another wording for austerity in the UK, would generate the confidence a recovery needs. I'd be happy to say that if Britain enjoys a boom for the next 2 years from increased confidence, I will change my opinion, he said. Larry Summers, who said that Japan was going to get an economic boost from their tsunami and disasters, which kind of points me to say GDP. Again, GDP. He's probably right about Japan. I knocked him for it, but he's right when it comes to GDP, but only because GDP, that politicians blah blah about, is such a moronic metric. When Japan was being built up around the tsunami area, all the building up went into GDP. When everything was levelled and smashed down, nothing was taken out of GDP. And when the area is rebuilt up again, there's more written into GDP. GDP is just a crap measure. It measures almost nothing. And this is probably why politicians are happy to bandy it about, because it's manipulatable, and meaningless. Anyway, let's move on to the Bretton Woods programme that Larry Summers was talking at. The links below. I am systematically going to watch and listen to every single word that's said and bring you the highlights if I think there are any, including the 1-hour keynote speech by Gordon Brown, who's actually said, bit naughty, that when he was Treasury man and Prime Minister, the banks were always pushing him and getting in his ear about no regulation, absolutely not necessary, we'll take care of everything. And he said it now just before the UK has released their new banking regulation proposals, which are, from what I've quickly gathered, are quite light. And we are now to learn, obviously, that the bank's still getting in the Prime Minister's ear and the Treasury man's ear. And Gordon Brown's kind of saying, yes, they did that with me as well. In other words, I'm saying they did it with me. Mea culpa. I was guilty. I listened to them, but don't you listen to them. And obviously, Macaroon and his chums in the UK won't have any choice. It's like the investment and all that banking shit is their star player, and their star player is an out of control maniac, but he's the star player. And what do you do when your star player's an out of control maniac? It's very difficult for the manager. What is all this nonsense? Anyway, the Telegraph again. UK disposable income falls to its lowest since 1921. CEBR said soaring inflation coupled with low pay rises means household peacetime disposable income is at its lowest since 1921. Let's go to the bottom of this. At the same time, salaries will rise just 1.9% as in unemployment remains high and the public sector makes cutbacks. Government cut back, obviously there's going to be pain. Larry Summers is right. He's right. Salaries will not rise as much as inflation. People will be poorer. we've talked a lot about these sorts of things, and I've read into a lot of these things, and I've got no advice for the politicians at all. I have no idea what to advise them how to act in the situation where I think they're completely and utterly doomed. They've had, in my opinion, 150 years of just sliding downhill on the back of cheap energy. And they're not going to, nobody, I'm not going to, you're not good, we're not going to know what to do when we hit the bottom of the hill and have to crawl our way back up the next hill. How are we meant to know? We haven't had to do this sort of thing for, multiple generations. Back in the United States, interesting enough little chart, dual income households peaking, both spouses working, that violet colour at the top, you can see it's turned over and now is getting less where husband and wife work, and only the husband working is turning up, and presumably there's another one to make up the 88%, so the other 12% is probably wife only working is turning up as well. This is quoting from Fisher, the Dallas Fed chap. This is from Seeking Alpha. Where is he from? Is he Texas, isn't he? Hey, Texas, Marx won't work, so it's going to have to be Nick language. Our duty is most distinctly not to monetize. The Fed must not monetize the debt, or even be perceived as monetizing. But most people are now starting to perceive it as monetizing, so tough titty on that. The debt of fiscally imprudent governments. So he's saying they must not be seen to be monetizing the debt of fiscally imprudent governments. In other words, they're trying to save their asses as well, or asses because they're in Texas, and saying we can't be seen to monetize the government's deficits. In other words, throwing the problem of the deficits on the government, because that is the government's responsibility. They do the spending. But it's actually seen now that the Fed is monetizing. And what they're monetizing is just another question. And he's quite right. What they are monetizing is profligate government spending. Having already peaked inside that door, and that's economic perdition, I feel strongly that we must now shut it and lock it and throw away the key. Basically, he's saying, let's not continue this silliness. But it's just jaw. They got absolutely and utterly no choice at all. They've seen what the government's been up to in the last month. They know what's going to happen in the next month. And it's giving the Fed an idea to sit on its hands after QE2 and say, you're going to have to scream at us to do the next QE3, because otherwise it's us that get it in the neck. Because that's who's getting it in the neck at the moment, isn't it? Who do we blame for all these commodities going up? It's not the government deficits we blame. We blame the Fed for monetizing or this QE2 stuff. In my view, no amount of further accommodation by the Fed would be wise. Could be just a no-choice job, but I think the Fed would like it that they are forced into QE3. But then by the time they're forced into QE3, it'll obviously have to be big enough to take up the slack of the gap between QE2 and being forced into QE3. In other words, it's going to have to be even bigger. We're just not getting anywhere at all. We're now, I think, rolling up a hill and falling back again. We've got no idea how to get traction to go up a hill. Let's finish with Tilt. Read it. Egypt, we've forgotten all about it. We think it's all taken care of. The army were behind it all. The army are going to take care of it because the army are good at sorting things out. The army might not have been behind it at all, but the army are now responsible for doing things. And the army don't know what to do because they probably weren't behind it in the first place. And it's all a mess. It's just another government, the army in Egypt. It's just a mess. There are messes all over the place. And normally in life, energy, it's ridiculous to think, but this fuel, energy with a bit of brightness up here can cure so many problems. And without that, thinking alone, it just isn't enough. Anyway, leave that for Tuesday. See you tomorrow. Bye.